So our focus today is going to be on the effects of Stalin's policies on those in the cities and those in the countryside. So 1935, Stalin announced to the Soviet people that life had become better, and that life had become more joyous. This, as you can probably imagine by 1935 and what we've looked at already, is far, far from the truth. In the reality was policies such as 5-year plans in industrialisation and collectivisation in agriculture had led to an overall decline in living and working conditions of most Soviet citizens. So firstly, living conditions in the towns. So housing was a major issue for Soviet workers. Stalin's policy of rapid industrialisation caused this explosion in the population of Soviet Union towns and cities, which increased rapidly. So Moscow's population went from 2.2 million in 1929 to 4.1 million in 1936. Leningrad's population went from 1.6 million in 1926 to 3.4 million in 1934. So quite frankly, the state wasn't ready and wasn't prepared to spend the limited resources that it had on building new houses. Instead, what it did was it divided the apartments that it had already built into ever smaller apartments. So the average family apartment declined from about 5.5 square metres in 1930 to about 4 square metres in 1940. So families ended up living in single rooms with communal kitchens, shared kitchens and shared bathrooms. And those were lucky ones. There was a long waiting list to receive a flat. And there were so-called corner dwellers. These were people who could live in a coal shed, an understair cupboard, a corridor, or in the communal kitchens. So living conditions in towns were tough. The housing in the new towns was even more of an issue. So these sort of factory towns that were constructed, like Magnitogorsk, that were constructed under the 5-year plans, they had themselves really inadequate housing. So Magnitogorsk's population went from 25, that's just 25, in 1929 to about 250,000 in 1932. So when they initially arrived there, workers needed to live in tents, or they needed to live in mud huts, whilst a more permanent solution was found. And although the housing did improve gradually throughout the 1930s, there were still basic style barrack dormitories by the end of the decade. So in other words, it wasn't good. So in these new towns, workers also had to deal with unpaved roads, which turned into mud in the winter. There was no street lighting, there was open sewers, there was a lack of public transport. So it felt basically like the Wild West, if you've ever watched any of those westerns. So crime and violence were common, and it was dangerous to go out on an evening. It was particularly dangerous for women to go out on an evening. So everyday items. So in the 1930s, it wasn't just housing which was a problem. There were problems with what I suppose we would today call everyday essentials. So because the 5-year plans focused so much on developing heavy industry, they didn't, as we've looked at, they didn't develop consumer products. So those everyday items were not a priority for the state. So many basic items which we take for granted, such as shoes and clothing, were in short supply. So queuing became something of a pastime for Soviet citizens in this period. When shoes became available, it was common that queues would have more than 1,000 people in them. More luxurious items such as watches and furniture were even more difficult to find. And for many, stealing supplies from work, shouldn't do that, became the normal way to get by. One proverb at the time said that he who does not steal robs his family. So problems with regards to collectivisation also meant that there wasn't enough food. So the bread was rationed until 1935. Even after this, there were regular, frequent shortages. The diet of the everyday worker fell well below the average diet or calorie intake of a worker from 1900. So queuing for food again became part of everyday Soviet citizens' lives. Some people waited outside food shops in the morning for hours and hours on end, even in winter when it was many degrees below freezing. So finally, leisure opportunities. So the authorities were aware that life was tough, and working with a limited budget, what they decided to do was develop the leisure opportunities that many Soviet citizens would have, and try and give them a little bit more. So Gorky Park opened in 1928 in Moscow. It offered gardens, it offered snack bars, a swimming pool, a music area, dance area, where you could go. It was particularly pleasant in summer with your boyfriend or girlfriend and sort of dance to the live music. Many other towns had these. They had parks, they had football stadiums, had athletics grounds, cinemas, swimming pools, all of these types of things. So the cinema in Magnitogorsk, for example, had annual audiences of around about 600,000 people. So what these figures suggest is that although many of the films had strong political messages, as we looked at when we looked at propaganda, the audiences must have enjoyed them. In particular, Civil War films proved to be popular, the sort of Soviet version of Hollywood westerns, I guess. There was also in Magnitogorsk, there was a mini Olympics held between teams that were made up from the various factories. And success there gave an opportunity to compete against those from factories from other towns and cities as well at a regional level.